say that it feels right.
To like show that and then go back and reiterate on it or be like, hey, here's future me and this is what I was stupid about, right? I figured I'll just re-record a new one and sort of show what's going on from a more informed perspective. If you could see, I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the end of the video, but the last save was at like 49 before we started crafting, right? Doing like hard crafting, right? We were at about 49 hours, right? So definitely a slower pace compared to like my previous character, but my previous character, I don't think I specifically went and got like 50 or 60 engineering and all that stuff, right? Like when he had 60, grabbed the gear. I didn't have quite as much understanding of the crafting system itself, and so while that guy did it, I think he was like just under 41 hours. This guy's gonna have a lot more, right? Now, if you see this, right, like we stopped at like 49 hours with the grinding, right, of those skills and started into the crafting. I did have to regrind some materials, so probably 5 or so hours of grinding there, right? But we're at 61 now, so that's somewhere around a 20-hour give or take difference, right? There is a bit more downtime, right? Like getting up from walking away from my computer because I wasn't recording, so not worried about, the downtime as much. So in much more casual style of gameplay, right? Probably anywhere between 10 to 12 hours of just pure crafting, right? Now that's a bit nutty, right? For some people. Some people probably think that that's light work, right? But that's about how much I'm willing to spend on this, right? And I've gotten the character to a place where I think that I'm happy with it. So I figured I'd show that and show you the loop and the things about the crafting system that I learned, and whatnot. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so first I ended up coming to Cassius Ryder, right? As my preferred Ripper Doc, right? If I need a new like Cockatrice or Reflex Tuner or like Dogtown, right? You can't get a new Quantum Tuner and you can't get a new Axolotl. So these are very important to be very, very selective with, right? But because I couldn't, right? These get the best mods if you get a best mod, right, like a best in slot type mod to pop, then these ones get them first, right? Other than that, the reflex, the revulsor, right, which could you could replace with a reflex tuner, right, and cockatrice, right, like these are things that I prefer in my build here. It's entirely possible to run different versions of this, right? So like for example, you could take the cockatrice eyes, run Doomsayers, right? Take this out, run like a reflex tuner, a regular reflex tuner, right? And then put in deep field visual, right? Which would reduce your crit or your crit chance, but increase it by, in my case, 18. If you had 20, it'd increase your crit chance by, or you'd increase your crit damage by 20%. It's 1% per cool point, right? Additionally, that might also free up enough, or maybe you drop the camo, go for something a little more defensive, like a subdermal armor, right? Maybe you don't want to use. I didn't use shock and awe on my first character, so we'll see how much difference that makes. But you could also just take this and turn it into a reflex tuner and put in the second heart, right? So like there are customizable options as to how you build this, but I'll explain why I'm set this way and sort of like what's going on there. So the first of that, right, is going to be that this stat sheet is good. It's good to help. It's good to sort of like understand where you're at, but it lies. It lies to you a lot, right? It does not lie to you about your crit chance. However, there are some things, for example, that just don't exist, right? In that stat sheet. For the melee damage, right? So like the 6.3 melee damage that we have down in the blue text. I can't make that stay, right? But down in the blue text, right, the 6.3, that it does show up, right? That's part of that 113 number that was there. However, the 27% melee on the top does not show in any way, shape, or form, right? That, like, you put these on, it never shows you that top number, right? Same thing, melee cost or stamina cost is never there. It also doesn't show, like, if you have electrical damage, like, for example, we have electrical damage on these, right? It doesn't show those. So those sort of stats are sort of like missing. So even though it's theorizing how much DPS you could be doing, it's literally just a stat thing, right? Like stat compression thing, where they're like, okay, so you've got, let's see, let's pull these out, right? And go to stats, right? It says, oh, you should be doing 614 damage per second. All it's doing is taking the base damage of my whatever weapon you have equipped when you hit I, right? And then it's going, you have that base damage multiplied by this many attacks per second. You have this percentage crit and this percent crit damage, and then putting that together. Charge multiplier, right? It can't equate it. Bonus ricochet damage, it can't equate it, right? These are just letting you know that you have these stats. Bonus stealth damage, it can't, right? It's not saying, otherwise it'd be like damage per second, and then it'd be like damage per second while stealth, right? So these things don't exist, but it also doesn't show on here like bonus electrical damage or bonus chemical damage or any of those things, right? And so this stat sheet is good. This is good base, right, to understand like sort of like where these things are at. But like I said, it lies. For example, we have 60% crit here, right? Now that is because of the cockatrice eyes and then the gear that we've chosen. However, if we go to skill progression, we get not an engineer, solo 50, 40? 40. Solo 40 gives us 10% crit chance against enemies within 5 meters. This is a global modifier and does work, right? Which means that we technically have 70, right? And because that's based off of, that's a conditional crit chance, it's not in here. As far as I can tell, if I take all my cyber gear off, I have 5% base crit chance, 10% from reflexes, and then 35% from the cockatrice eyes because they're fully upgraded, which gets me to 50. And then I have 5 pieces with 2% crit from being reflex attuned for crit chance, right? Getting us to 60, right? The good thing about this is it makes it a nice pretty number on our stat sheet, right? When we berserk, because we are using the Biodyne Berserk, right? The reflex attuned is chance during berserk, right? So this 1% crit chance during berserk per attribute point, that is during berserk, but that is in addition to, that is not flat, right? To the 20% crit that we get while berserking from the implicit modifiers, the 30% attack speed, 20% crit, and 100% crit damage. Thus meaning that the Biodyne Berserk is actually since the implicit stats only happen when Berserk is up, and then the reflexes attuned only applies during the Berserk like time frame as well, right? This is effectively a 30 attack speed, 40 crit damage, or 40 crit chance, and 100% crit damage, right? Making it broken good, which at 60, right, us being at 60% crit, means that we get to 100. But since we have the 10 crit from the solo level 40, right? We're technically at 110% crit. So I think I need to do a wait. Um, with that being said, the stat sheet lies is a good tool to sort of understand where you're at, but you sort of have to know what things are in play for your build, right? Whatever it is, right? And then use the stat sheet to sort of understand where you're at, right? Because one of the things that will happen, right, for example, with our melee build, oh, I can't do it, right? With our melee build is that we're sort of trying to balance this melee damage, right? So let's say this is a 213, right? We get, or 113, that's a 213, a 2.13 multiplier, right? On our melee damage, right? But we have 20%, 27% melee damage on the dense marrow, right? That does work, but doesn't show in here. So this would actually be 200 or 130, right? So we're technically at a 2.3 multiplier, right? And there are some other pieces in there, right, that can do that. Like for example, at least if my conversations with the AI, like Gemini and stuff like that, are to be believed, the melee damage and the electrical damage are in the same bucket, right? Like so you have base damage, then you have additive multipliers, then you have multiplicative multipliers like crit, right? And so since crit is a multiplicative multiplier, but multiplicative multipliers are rare, most things end up in the additive bucket, right? So this is this is a 2.3, right? Once you get to 2.3, right, you're better off getting your crit damage to 2.3, right? And when they're equal, they have equal value, right? But as one becomes higher than the other, right? So like if we only had 10% melee damage, but we had 75% crit damage, we would get more bang for our buck out of increasing our melee damage, because this every point here gets multiplied by this 75%. Right, so if we get, if we got 10% increase melee damage, we'd get, 10, an extra 7.5 in theory, right, out of here, right? So that's sort of where that like scaling happens, at least for this. Netrunner builds and whatnot, they should follow similar math logic, right, with different stats. So in our quest for that, right, we and having the Biodyne Berserk, right, knowing that we have 40%, one of the things that happened was like we have 5 at base, we have 10 from reflexes, that's 15. If we get 30, like Cockatrice Eyes here, we get to 35%, we're at 50 already. We don't need any reflex attuned stuff, right? So we could use all armor. We could use technical stuff. Like we could use whatever we wanted, right? Without worry, right? So like the spring joints, right? Like we can use the mitigation strength. If we had cyberware capacity, or if we preferred, let's say we preferred the titanium bones, there's nothing stopping us from grabbing these titanium bones, putting them in here, right? Other than cyber capacity, right? If you wanted to run bionic joints, which are cheaper, right? You could do that, right? So in my previous build, I ran the Parabellum with the bionic joints. I think this setup's an improvement on that. However, the extra armor here, right, from the percentage armor, right, and the higher armor from the bionic joints over here, isn't necessarily to be snuffed at. So if you wanted to be tankier, I'm trying them a bit more glass cannony build, right? But because I'm relying more on the Berserk, you could totally run these things, right? I also find that it is very, very tight on the cyber stuff, right? Like we are at max. Like we get 356, we are at 356. There's no room for error here, right? Um, and part of that is because of the cost of these two. You know, we're taking up 93 points just in these two pieces, right? And then we are taking the 30 out of the cockatrice, right, eyes, but and we could change this, right? It's entirely possible. Like one of the things you could do is you can go to um, take these two doomsayers, right? Um, Now, if you did this, because you lose the 35% cockatrice, you lose a ton of crit chance, right? And because you lose a ton of crit chance that way, you're sort of pigeonholed into needing crit, right? So like even if you got, um, I think you can put like 10 pieces, right? But then you're putting and you can get another 10 pieces of reflex attunement, right? To get the crit chance, right? I would argue that it's not quite 10, right? To be fair, because like you'd have to put a Kresnikov, or I think this is a Defensenikov and a Kresnikov on here, and those are only when you're like the active effect, right, would be only, when you're sliding or jumping and aiming, right? So like you're not getting the slow time. They would literally just be critical strike stat sticks, right? And then so you're gonna get a maybe 10, right, if you're lucky, right? And then there's 20 pieces, right? So you could get away with um, if you rolled perfect, crit, right? So like similar to this one, right, where this has 1% crit on here, right? With the cyberware perks and whatnot, that maximum is 1.5. Right. So if you just ignored it and you got 1.5% crit chance on every piece, and you had 20, if you fill it all out, I think it's like 20 pieces, right? Then you could have 30% increased crit, right? Which means that you're still 5% below. So in addition to that, you would have to um, have at least 3 of these items, right, that were reflex crit attuned, right, to get to that 100% crit mark, right? But you're only looking at getting to 50, right? So that's sort of like where you're at, right? You would need 3 of these, and you need 1.5% crit on every one of these. Unfortunately, right, that is way more time than I'm willing to put into it, unless you used a like stat adjuster for your cyberware, right? In that case, right, go ham, right? But because that's sort of like not feasible, I stick with the cockatrice eyes. No, stick with them entirely, right? Because um, I don't want to have to worry about my crit there. The other options here, right? If you did the Doomsayer, right? You do get better options. You get the deep field visual interface. You can also still run the revulsor, right? And you could take the revulsor off if you don't think you need it. You could run a reflex tuner instead, or a stabber, right? But if you run the reflex tuner instead, that's 5, right? You could run the second heart here, right? Or maybe you run heal on kill instead, right? And then you have even more space, right, for other things. Now this deep field visual interface is the equivalent of basically like an extra, a nerfed version of having another 20 cool points, right? And that's a big increase. However, 18% crit isn't particularly huge, right? Because if you were rolling critical damage on your gear, I think you can get like upwards of 4%. Like your perfect rolls are like 4%, and you have 20 items. That's 80%, right? I think we'll have 19, right? So, but right, like you can get way more out of just rolling crit, right? Having more items and rolling crit damage on it, right? And then it also takes up too much for me, right? I can't wear my cockatrice and this while having while having a revulsor. I can do it with a reflex tuner, right? So it's sort of up in the air how you want to play it. If you want to add in crit damage, this is a good spot, right? If you want to, and if you're comfortable with the reflex tuner slowing you down, etc., etc. I don't want it to slow me down. I want the effect without the slowdown, so I am sticking with. Oh, I hit the wrong button. I hit the right click.
So, my test.
No, 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 that's not what I wanted. So because I want to not be slowed when the slow time happens, I'm sticking with the revulsor. And because of that, I am basically pigeonholed into this, which makes me a little tankier. It gives me more mitigation chance and more mitigation strength, which pairs with my mitigation chance here when I'm above 85% stamina and my mitigation strength, right, with mitigation chance here, right? So this is sort of like a nice little combo, the 1, 2, and 3, right? And that's sort of like the logic, right? Additionally, right, we have moved to electrifying gorilla arms, and one of the reasons for this is because people and things generally have less resistances than they have armor, and some of the late game things have some pretty big armor amounts, right? And so the nuisances, right, like mechs and stuff like that, they have sort of like a vulnerability to shock, right, or to electrical damage anyway. All right, and electric arms basically just convert 100% of our damage into shock damage, and then give us a 20% chance to shock, right? And if we shock, it's more like a burst, right, rather than a like the character gets hit with the shock damage, it chains, right, and then it does a little bit of like electrical over time, I think, right? With that being said, right, the armor reduction still applies to these things, right? So according to the data that I could find, right, that armor on enemies still applies as sort of like a damage reducer to sort of like all damage, right? You still have resistances, and so like the points where we reduce the armor from a power attack, that still affects and helps our electrical damage here, right? In the damage equation, right? So there's no downside to picking up a different version, right? Like, so you could use, if you wanted to do damage over time, or maybe you wanted to combine the chemical version of the arms, right, and then add in the Black Mamba, right, where you then get 18% increased damage against poison enemies, right? Well, you have a 20% chance to poison. You're doing poison damage or chemical damage all the time, so you eventually, like, just smacking something poisons them, right? And then all of a sudden you're doing a flat 20% increased damage, right? That could be pretty powerful. I just don't want to wait to poison anything. Like, this character does not want to survive long enough to have something get a debuff so that they can then do their damage. We want to hit, and when our hit goes off, we want it to just burst. We would just want it to blow up, right? Which means that for us, the physical gets bleeding damage, right? And that's good, but it's not. But it doesn't scale as well, and it's you still have to wait for them to bleed, right? Or like you bleed somebody, and then you have to wait for that damage to go off, right? So shock, right? So like there's bleed, there's burn, there's poison, and then there's shock. And shock is the only one that sort of like has a pop, right? And then that pop, right, does the initial damage, and then that initial damage has the little like after tick, right? And it's based off of all that, right? Additionally, because we're doing shock now, we have the ability to do what we did here, which is prioritize some electrical damage, right? And so like with this being in the same bucket, 3.2 melee and 6.4 electrical are basically equal, right? Because they're in the same bucket, they're additive, they just basically just add together, right? So this overall is what, 9.6% increase to our physical, to our punch, which is not something that's even achievable in physical, because there is no, armor pen or increased physical damage modifier. And because there's not, the maximum you could get on a physical setup is 7.5, right? And that's the god roll for the melee damage, right? So if you got 7.5 on these, that's great, but you're still not beating my 3.2 melee damage if I've got 6 electrical. And the god roll for these would be double 7.5s, right? So like you could get 15%, which makes these, electrifying even better. Now you can get the same thing with I think thermal, and for burning, chemical for the chemical ones, right, etc., right? But again, like I said, I want the shock and I want the pop. And by being electric, anything that we hit that is a robot gets an additional damage modifier because they're weaker to that, right? And then we're also going to be running the Mechatronic core, which will mean that we get another 37, like 1.37, or basically like 1.4 at the end of it, right? 1.4 multiplier to that, right? And we have a couple options here from rolls we had. I can go 7 electrical, right? But I'm not I have a 7% possible, right? But I like the melee damage resistance and health damage bonus, or health regen bonus, as the defensive stats with 5.2. So I'm preferring to hold on to this one, right? And that's the one I'll run, right? If I run into any problems with it, then we'll move forward. So with that sort of explanation out of the way, this is what we came up with, right? We ended up, we wanted to be really picky, right? And so we started out real picky, going for like 6 plus melee damage, and we required crit damage, right? Or crit chance, right? But because the Cockatrice Eyes removed to Doomsayer, right, only gets us 18% crit damage, right, and costs us a ton of time, right? Getting a getting a perfect roll, because there's once you get to tier 5 plus, there's 35 substats, right, that it can roll, right? And I believe the math with Chip Connoisseur, right, is basically that you have a 1 in 145 to roll a perfect modifier of any of a type, right, that you're looking for. 1 in 145, right? And then or to get a high tier roll, right? And then it was like 1 in 14,000 to get a perfect modifier, right? With the other modifier, and then it was like 1 in 4 million for a double perfect stat, right? And I'm not gonna roll 4 million times multiplied by 20, cyberware stats. That's not gonna happen. Right, I'm not doing 80 million rolls here, right? If you want perfect stats, go get a stat modifier and do it, right? So then we sort of looked at, with Cockatrice Eyes, we don't need any crit damage or crit chance, because we get all the crit chance we need just by having this one item, right? So and we're going to overcap with any of these, reflex crit attuned items that we naturally have in our build anyway. So we no longer, so that devalues crit chance as a modifier on here, and then we swapped to the electrical fists for the previously mentioned reasons, which means that now electrical damage is huge, right? Now, that changed our goal of the best in slot to being from melee damage, crit chance, and crit damage to melee damage, electrical damage, and crit damage. However, like I said, getting a triple roll like that is virtually impossible. And I believe the game sort of does try to budget, where if you have a high roll of one thing, it tries to give you a low roll of another, right? It's ultra rare, right? The game is actively trying not to give you a high roll, high roll, high roll, right? It wants to budget, like give it a max budget almost, right? And so what you end up with is like you can get a high roll. You'll get one, right? And you'll get a few, right? Like I got a 7.5 here. I think I got a 7.2 here. I got a 7 here, right? So like they're not impossible to get. They're not, gone, right? 6.9 here, right? But they're just extremely difficult to get, and trying to pair them together is super difficult, right? And then doing that on 20 pieces is not in the wheelhouse of what I'd be willing to put time to, right? So what you end up with is I just basically focused on one stat, technically two, right? Because of the electrical damage bucket, right? And so we got good rolls on basically everything. We got 5-2 here. We have 6-3, 6-2. This is technically a 9.6, right? 6, and we basically just tried to hit 6. Now this one is 5.2, but we got crit damage with it, right? So even though we didn't crest the 6 mark on our melee damage, we're willing to take it because the crit damage is a multiplier against the melee damage, which basically makes this like a 10.8 or something like that, right? Like it's much higher, or 12 or 15%, right? Basically. So so that worked out well, right? So we basically won't replace this unless we got we could get 7% melee damage and we wouldn't replace this, right? It would have to have crit damage with it, right? Because that 2.4 crit damage multiplier, it then applies to all these pieces. So we then move here, 6, 6, 9, 6, 1, 6, 3, 6, 5, 6, 9, a 5, 6, right? Now we technically have a 6, 5 in electrical damage here, but it has like melee resist instead of explosion resist, right? And I wanted the melee damage number to be at like 113, right close to that 120 mark. So we held onto this to chill there. We have a 5-4 here that we did not replace with a 6 because the bonus damage against enemies at full health is also an additive multiplier, making this more of a 9.3, right, when they're full health. And so this is basically just helping us, like when we first smack a mob, we do more damage to it, right, and smack it. And since those are in a similar bucket, and it also has a defensive stat, we just left it there, right? Because we haven't gotten a 6 with a defensive stat or 6 with double offensives, right? So we got a 5-3 here. This has got bonus stealth damage, which is another offensive. We plan on using optical camo at some points throughout the run. So even though this is a 5-3, the 9.3 is not percentage based. That's flat. So I believe that happens on base damage when, which means that all of your multipliers, your crit and your melee damage, become multipliers against that. So that gives the stealth damage a pretty high weighting. We got 7 here. We got 7.5 here. 5.3 on this one. This one could be better, but it did have the health item effect as well. And I just got tired of re-rolling, right? So this could be better with like one extra mod. This one got 5.8 with health item effect, and then this one can't. These two can never roll it, right? And these two never need to be upgraded. Like we will upgrade them. We'll upgrade this, right? Only for the EMP blast, which is based off of the quality of your cyberware. So I want to make sure that all of my cyberware is at 5++. But other than that, that ends up giving us, like I said, like I showed the stats, sitting at 113 on our melee damage, right? And then we have like an invisible 10, 15, something like that, electrical damage. The electrical damage applies to our EMPs and like the stuff like that, which we get out of the character, right? From the skill progression Fury, and we do an EMP blast, and EMP blasts are electrical, so they'll get boosted by that. The Shock and Awe cyberware that we had gives a EMP blast, and so does Ticking Time Bomb, right? So with the three of those, they're all just basically going off, right, allowing us to, and they're being increased by the electrical damage. So with all that, we end up in a pretty solid spot. Basically, on the other with the other character, I believe we were pretty close to the same stats with 60% melee damage, right? We had capped crit. I think we had just a little less, if not equal, crit damage. And then obviously this is a big part because if we've doubled our melee damage from that video, right? Which means that the other modifiers are all going to be multiplying on that. So, yeah, that should cover all of that. Oh, there we go.
So, my tattoo.
God, I hate that I do that all the time. There we go. The way we do that, right? So to explain how to fish these stats, right? And why I chose Cassius Rider is because Cassius Rider gives us a tattoo that we earned from our Wakako job that we don't pay for. We can get this tattoo every time, and we can just walk out here. We can get out of the chair, walk back out here, wait 24 hours to reset his inventory, and walk back to him and do it all over again and get another one, right? And what this does is it means that we have a free, no cost way to make sure that we are always, we are able to spend our low tier mats rather than buying high tier items and spending our high tier mats, right? So that's how we do that, right? And then the skeletal stuff has the what is considered the cleanest like melee mod, right? And the cockatrice has the cleanest crit mod. Basically, what this means is that they have priorities. So like if a seed rolls high tier, right? Like it rolls like super high tier, and it's a 7.5 here, and then we were to put it on the look at the quantum tuner, it might only be a 7.2, right? It's also possible that like looking at a quantum tuner, it might be a 6.8, putting it on here, it might be a 7.2, right? So there is sort of like some small discrepancies based off the slot. Same thing would happen here, cockatrice, right? Maybe it's a 1.5 here, and we're like, oh, we got a 1.5 mod. We come over here and it's a 1.3, 1.2, something like that, right? So those are sort of so that just makes it so that we want to fish with our skeletal mod. And so the way we fish is we basically just go to this upgrade, right? We get to see our current seed, and then we get to see the next seed and the seed after that, right? But because we get to see both of them, we don't want either of these, right? So we would be like, oh, I don't want this at all, right? So I want to try again, right? Normally, if you're like, oh, I'd grab this one, that does move the seed forward, right? But and we keep our stats, right? But we're trying to fish for optimals, and if we did that over and over again, we'd eventually have to just buy tier 5 items and keep going, right? And replace them over and over again. Instead, we can just upgrade this one. Instead, get it from tier 1 to tier 1 plus, right? That then moves the seed forward, but because we have chip connoisseur, it moves it forward by 2, right? So those 2 go away and we get the next one in line, right? And here we have 4% electrical damage, carrying capacity. We don't want either of these either, right? So on the 5. Now, you'll notice, right, so we have ricochet, health, item, explosion, etc., right? So if we look at these, we don't have those here, right? Though technically we kind of do, right? We have health, bonus stealth, and reload speed, right? And in this one, we had health item effect, right? Bonus ricochet and explosion damage, right? So they're technically in different tiers, right? This is flat health, right? And what I believe happens here is that they're entirely different, or they're not entirely different. In the lower tiers, they don't have access to some of the mods, right? Like I think like crit chance while shocked, explosion or while under effect, right? Explosion damage resistance, right? Some of the other stuff, right? They don't really. I guess they do have explosion damage resistance there, but some of those higher mods, right? That show up in tier 4s and tier 5s, like crit. I think crit damage is a later mod for 4 and 5. They don't show up in 2s. So rather than not having a mod, it just re-rolls it, right? Or it rolls a different version of it, right? And so when you get to here, where you're like, okay, we have bonus ricochet, health item effect, and explosion damage, if it's like, I can't roll those down here, I'm going to make this different one, which is why we see these different tiers. Now, this also may be, and that I know that happens in like tier 3 on, right? But or 3 plus. I know it happens in 4. 4 like shares its stuff with 5. But at like 3 plus, right, you'll see very similar items or very similar options with like one thing different or something like that. And we'll sort of go through that and see if we get a good example of it. And this is the loop, right? This is what I basically did for 12 to 15 hours, right? As I checked this, said nope, don't want it. Come over here, right? So we got melee damage, carry capacity, and health item recharge speed, right? And here we had melee damage resistance. Oh, here we had melee damage resistance. Yeah, so I think 2 has its own thing, right? Like its own thing tier. We check here, melee damage, 3.9 melee damage. We don't want any of these, right? Armor melee. This reduced damage from poison enemies. Pretty sure that's a high tier mod, right? So if we look at this going to a 3, we have armor, melee damage resistance, and melee, right? Now if we went back here, we have armor, melee damage, and reduced damage from poison, right? Like I said, I think this is a high tier mod, right? And on the other one, we have stealth damage, melee damage, health item effect, right? Melee damage, health item effect, stealth damage is missing, right? So I don't think that, so I think 2, right? 2 has its own tier, specifically because it doesn't have access to the mod, to all of the mods per se, right? But it, I don't think it's necessarily its own tier per se, but as much as like it just doesn't have access to the mods, right? So it changes, and so very often you get a re-roll of the mod because it can't access it, which makes it look very, very different, right? Once you get in tier 3, you start getting access to more of them, right? And they sort of like end up in this similar thing, right? So you end up with this same seed, right? Which means that we then get to upgrade this one because we didn't want any of those. Yep. Take that and we move it forward again, right? We get crit, health, regen, melee damage, resistance, health item, ricochet, right? There we go. See, the crit was a higher mod, so it re-rolled it. We got damage over time, melee damage resistance, ricochet, and we got carry capacity instead, right? We don't want either of those, so we're going to upgrade here. And we would just repeat this process, right? And we'll go all the way to, basically to like 4 is going to show us, right? So like we have these, we have health, explosion, health item recharge, right? And we come here, health, explosion, health item recharge. Once we hit 4, all these match, right? 4 and 5 share the same thing. They'll have different values, right? Now, additionally to note, right, is this, right? When we got that melee damage mod, it was like a 1.9 or something like that, right? When if it hits tier 3, so the jumps happen on the tier, right? So like this 2.1 is the same. It's 2%. It's 2% in blue. It was 2% in tier 3. It is 2% in tier 3 plus. It's 2.1 in tier 4, right? It'll be 2.4 or 2.1 uh, in 4 plus, right? So like we'll look at our upgrade first, make sure we don't need to add anything. Nope, we got 3.6 over here. So rather than pick up the 3.6, we're going to stick with the 1. We stick it to 2.1 at 4 plus, and then it'll get another bump if we were to upgrade it to tier 5, 2.2. Now, the reason this matters is that melee damage is a mod that you can get all the way down at tier 1. So if you had a brand new, white one that rolled 4% or higher, right, like 4.5% or something like that on its melee damage, you know that by the time that hits 5.5, it's 7. The problem with that is that when you go from tier 1 to tier 2, or when you get out of tier 1 and you'll get an extra modifier, right? When you go to tier 2, you're going to get a triple modifier, right? But here's an example of what happens when you get that mod, that 4% mod early. Is I got it on the 2 modifier pull, so I was never able to replace that melee modifier onto a 3 item or a 3 substat, right? And so I don't want to use this, right? It in theory has the one piece that I want, and it has an extra stat that I do like, right? So I could use this if I had space. Like if I swapped over to the visual cortex and ended up at 354, I would replace this tattoo with the ballistic copressor here, and then I would go from a 7.5 to a 7.2, right? And I'd be fine, right? So yeah, so that's sort of how that functions in general, and how you roll your seed forward, right? And then interestingly enough, if I had to do this all over again, what I did was I upgraded all my blue stuff that was in these slots, right? Blues, greens, whatever I had acquired, right? As I was going through, and I had planned on doing that from the start. That's why whenever I was upgrading while I was leveling, I was just buying a new piece, right? Unless I had a really good roll, I was just buying a new piece, right? Which kept my power level down on my character, but also basically made it so that I had extra things to roll, right? But since at tier 3, right, I can get access to basically everything I want. Maybe not some of the stealth damage increase and stuff like that, some of the higher tier good ones, right? But I could potentially get, melee damage, electrical damage, right? Or at the very least melee damage, explosion resist and health item recharge or something like that. I could get a really good version of that, and because that stat pool is lower, and I will be rolling it every time for everything, right? I can come here, use the white one, and then when I roll through that tier, like if I'm like, I got a green one that has triple mods that I like, right, with a high roll melee, I can go through and be like, I've got a dense marrow, right, that's also green, that matches that, put it on that, and now all I have to do is roll that dense marrow up, and now I have a 7, right, there, rather than having a 7%, on multiple hand items, right, rather than having multiple tattoos, right? Because I've had several tattoos roll into the 6s or whatnot, and whatnot, and then it's only because I was able to, I got the mod at in tier 3, but I couldn't put it on any of these items. I couldn't put it on any of these pieces because I didn't have a tier 3 mod. So if I had to do it again, I would keep them. I would keep them in my inventory, but I would just roll my, like any of my junk rolls. My burner roll would only be on the Tiger Claw, free tattoo, right? And then if I got a really good one that I wanted to push through, I would then put it on one of those items, right? And then push it through. So, all in all, we are now finished with that, right? We're at a comfortable spot, and so now it's time to finish our upgrades to see what our, and I don't think we'll be adjusting, right? We'll go 5-2. We don't need this 4-4-6, right? And so we're not fishing anymore. We're just upgrading the pieces that we have to completion. We'll check, right? But unlikely to have a replacement. It would be hilarious if we got a replacement. Nope, not there. And I think this is going to take 600 or so for us. Yep, we're 6.5. Hey, look, we got crit chance. And it doesn't matter on this one. There, now we should be all 5++, right, on the entire thing. We're sitting at just under 700 armor, right? If we change these to different items, right, we could be, I think I was at like 973, so it was a bit higher. Additionally, we're leaving out one of these. If we adjusted these around, let's say we were doing the higher armor version and we did a regular reflex tuner instead of a revulsor, then we could also get an item in here, whether that be heal on kill, blood pump, whatever, or like secondary heart, whatever that might be. All right, we put that there and we would get another chance to roll our modifiers, right? So that could be another 7%, which would, if we got 7% here, that would pretty easily put us at the 120 mark on the stat sheet, right? So that's another option, right? And it's like, what's more, if you're doing that, you sort of have to weigh out like, I get more armor, I get more melee damage, but I don't get the deep visual cortex. If I swap that over and go to deep visual cortex, I'm more constrained, right? And my best in slot changes because I don't have the cockatrice eyes, right? In fact, I think with the cockatrice eyes, if you were to go for best in slot stats, would be melee damage, electrical damage, and crit damage, right? And if you got those, right, you could be, and you were full up on basically each one of these would be 15% in that additive bucket, right? Which would make it to where you finally crested beyond, sort of like where your additive bucket was super high, making crit damage more valuable. Thus, the crit damage on all these would be super important. So if you had 20 of them and you had 4.5, if you had 4%, it's 80. If you had 4.5, I think it's 90. Right. So if you got another 90%, crit damage out of that, right, that would be a multiplier on all of those 15% in the additive bucket, right? So like you could really push this to some crazy amounts with like a stat modifier. But that's all glass cannon, and that would also mean that maybe you could or would want to specifically be like, okay, so this is 15% in additive plus 4.5%, almost 5% in multiplicative, right, against that, right, that one slot likely is significantly more important than the revulsor effect, right? Or and so if that is right, you trade this out for a reflex tuner, get the same base stuff here, right? Put the set the blood pump or whatever you want here, and move it forward, right? I think I used a blood pump, right, to get this like parabellum and bionic joints, right, for more armor, right? So you can play around with this, right, as to where you want it to go, but in the end, right, that's sort of what you're trying to do, is basically make those additive buckets multiply against each other, and then do that off the base. So with that, we should be it's a bit of a long crafting episode, right? An explanation of like the character, but we will be able to start doing our Don't Fear the Reaper runs, right? So we'll probably do a Don't Fear the Reaper run, finish it all the way through, right? And then for the showcase, and then likely do some practice on those and try to push some sort of like speed versions of that, and see if we can't get to our 10-second smasher kill, and see if we can't do it faster. I am worried potentially that we might hit him too hard and not be able to health gate his or do the phase skipping. So that remains to be seen. But with all that out of the way, hopefully the information was helpful. I know I learned quite a bit while I had a pretty good base, but I learned quite a bit by rolling and stuff like that, and in how mods worked, and probabilities of those mods, which obviously changed the way I was approaching the modding process in general, or the rolling process in general. So, well, I don't need to sleep. We will take shower for the health regen, and then hopefully when we come back we'll be doing some Don't Fear the Reaper stuff. So I'll see you then.